The people of South Sudan are facing life-threatening food shortages as harvests have fallen due to conflict, natural disasters and the impact of COVID-19. Communities in 9 out of the 10 states in South Sudan harvested an average of 50% less cereal and vegetables in 2020 than they did in 2019.
As the lean season begins, tens of thousands of families, especially in Jonglei, Upper Nile, Warrap, Unity and Lake states, are struggling for survival without an adequate harvest from 2020 and following the loss of other food reserves to conflict, armed violence and floods. In the Equatorial states, communities also face a heightened risk of hunger after thousands of people fled their homes, losing crops and livestock due to ongoing conflict. The COVID-19 pandemic has deepened existing vulnerabilities, especially in the healthcare system, which has been weakened or destroyed by decades of conflict and armed violence. A renewed outbreak of violence or the intensification of conflict is likely to increase the chance of immediate, life-threatening food shortages for hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese. Combined with the impacts of COVID-19 and climatic shocks, many South Sudanese in remote and vulnerable communities face challenging months ahead this year.
Now, for more on this, we're now joined by Marwa Awad, who's the spokesperson for the World Food Programme in South Sudan. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. A very, very difficult time for the people of South Sudan.
Indeed, it is. This is actually the hardest time the South Sudanese people have been going through or are going through since the country announced its independence 10 years ago. The reason for this is the compounding effects of food insecurity, which is coming as a result of ongoing conflict as well as climate change, and of course the economic effects of COVID-19.
This is something that's been building up because you've been helping the South Sudanese for a number of years already, haven't you?
Yes, absolutely. The World Food Programme has the biggest footprint in the country. We are reaching more than 5 million people on a yearly basis.
How many people are vulnerable at this time?
So according to our latest assessments, as well as the assessments of independent panels that are specialized in food security, we know that 60% at the moment of the population is facing increasing hunger, meaning they either cannot afford an average meal or they cannot access food on a daily basis. And this is a problem because as conflict continues and the effects of climate change play out, people are having harder times to access their farmlands or to have livestock. A lot of the livestock had died off due to the ongoing flooding. And so this makes the work of aid organizations such as the World Food Programme ever more important right now.
How have you been able to do this work in the middle of a pandemic? Because that must be a compounding a challenge.
Absolutely. COVID-19 is the kind of challenge that we hadn't really gone through since at least the Ebola breakout. And so what humanitarian organizations, including WFP, have done is to put in place the necessary measures and contingency plans to ensure that we keep our staff on the ground, because ultimately we are our operations are very, very important for the survival of the populations. But we've also taken into account things like physical distancing as well as hand hygiene, and changed the way we distribute food so that less and less people are present at a certain distribution point.
What about access to the people in need? In a situation of insecurity, I guess getting to them must be quite challenging. I'm just remembering what happened with the Italian ambassador not too far away in the DRC, again on a WFP mission.
Yes, that was a very unfortunate event, unfortunately, really tragic, and it did affect a lot of us within the World Food Programme. So for South Sudan, yes, the chronic violence is an issue, and in the last year there was a spike in conflict between, we call it subnational violence, so between various groups, specifically around the area of Jonglei State and the greater Pibor area. And when conflict hits, the World Food Programme and other agencies are unable to access, because we require safe access in order to deliver food assistance and nutritional assistance to people. So we tend to hold off on the distributions, call on the parties to stop the fighting, and once some kind of negotiation has been reached, then we continue our deliveries. There are specific areas that are hard to reach, whether there's conflict or not. For example, inaccessible areas within Pibor County, and those, to reach them, we run a series of airdrops across the country, and Pibor County is an example of that receives airdrops, and those airdrops provide the necessary food for the people's survival.
You know, as journalists, we use words like life-threatening food shortages. Is that an exaggeration, or is that literally what's happening on the ground?
It's not an exaggeration by any means. The situation is getting worse, and this is why we are calling on the international community and the donor community to step up their aid and assistance. Right now, it's been 10 years since South Sudan became a country, and people have had many aspirations in the past, and unfortunately, a lot of these hopes and dreams are going to disappear if continued hunger is the case. Now, we are stepping up our assistance. We are trying to reach more numbers. 5 million is a big number, but we know that there are 7.2 million who are very food insecure. But of course, there is more work that needs to be done, specifically in South Sudan, that goes beyond the emergency aid. And what we're talking about is the kind of pre-development job opportunities creation and building in areas where there is difficulty to access natural resources because of lack of infrastructure. We want donors and the world to know that the number one solution right now for South Sudan is first and foremost emergency aid, but also gearing up the support for livelihoods, those kinds of programs that enable people to rebuild their lives and build their resilience on their own.
We've seen donor funding start to slow and get less and less in other regions. Is this something that you've experienced in South Sudan as well, that we're just not getting the help that you used to get, partly because of COVID-19, I guess, and a depressed business environment?
Yes, I mean, the reasons are many. Definitely COVID-19 is a reason, but also the other one being the competing crises. Unfortunately, South Sudan is not the only country that's suffering from ever-increasing rates of food insecurity. Yemen is another, and also certain parts of the African continent. So what we try to do is focus on the narrative that South Sudan can be a happy story. It can be a successful story. All that we need is commitment from donors to continue their funding of our emergency aid operations, but also to look towards funding livelihoods programs. Very often, donors would tell you, well, let's wait until the post-conflict situation arrives, and then we can roll out the programs that create jobs. But we're saying, no, you have to turn this equation on its head. You must actually support both emergency and those resilience programs, because then they give people hope and people stop fighting one another and instead focus on growing their own food and running their own businesses.
Going back to what we started with, this whole story of not having enough food, and I guess one of the consequences of that is, and a fear that you might have, is malnutrition increasing as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, indeed. We know that for 2021, this year, the number of malnourished children will go up to 1.4 million. And this is, of course, a concern, because once you have malnutrition, then you know that if it's not stopped and the tide is turned, then this will lead to ultimately to hunger. So WFP, what we do is that we roll out programs that are targeting children who are under 5 years of age, as well as mothers and pregnant women. And this offers them a boost in addition to the average food ration that we provide.
Marwa Awad, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed for telling this very important story, and let's just hope that the necessary help and aid and assistance comes through so that you can carry on doing the work that you're doing. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, that's Marwa Awad, who's the spokesperson for the World Food Programme in South Sudan. And 9 out of 10 states in the country have got a mass of vulnerable people who are facing life-threatening hunger if help doesn't come and come soon.